A starving dog stood between a homeless man and a freezing night, while the town chose to look away. A broken seal, carrying grief heavier than war, saw them and couldn't walk past. He gave them his last bread, never knowing that moment would change his life forever. Days later, the coldest storm in decades arrived, and the old man vanished without a trace. What the seal found in the snow was not just a rescue, it was a choice between life and regret. But the dog didn't just survive, it chose, and that choice would heal a man who thought he was beyond saving. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, like and subscribe to the channel. The morning in Briar Glen did not arrive gently. It came sharp and bright, like a blade polished by winter itself. Sunlight spilled across the town's narrow main street, striking the snow until it shimmered like broken glass. It was beautiful in the way cold things often are, distant, untouched, unwilling to bend. People moved through it wrapped in thick coats and quiet routines. Boots crunched softly, doors opened and closed with brief bursts of warmth and laughter that never lasted long enough to linger outside. Life continued, as it always did in small northern towns, steady, practical, and careful not to look too closely at anything that might complicate it. At the edge of that motion walked a man most had learned not to see. Walter Boone moved slowly, each step deliberate, as though the ground might vanish if he trusted it too much. He was somewhere in his 70s, though time had not kept count kindly. His frame was thin, shoulders slightly bent forward under the weight of years spent outdoors. A weathered coat, brown once, now an uneven patchwork of repairs, hung loosely from his body. Beneath it, layers of flannel and wool tried and failed to hold warmth against the biting air. His face carried the kind of lines that told stories no one had asked to hear. Hollow cheeks, a jaw shadowed by uneven gray stubble, and skin marked by wind and cold. But his eyes, tired as they were, still held a quiet steadiness, not hopeful, not defeated, just present. Beside him walked something that did not belong to the same fate. Sable was a German shepherd, about 5 years old, large even in his current condition. His coat was black and tan, though dulled by dirt and the long memory of cold nights. Ribs pressed faintly beneath his fur, a silent record of hunger. But nothing about him felt broken. His ears stood upright, alert. His posture was measured, controlled. His amber eyes moved constantly, tracking the world with a calm awareness that suggested discipline rather than fear. He walked close to Walter's side, not out of dependence, but out of choice. A guardian without uniform, a sentinel without rest. Walter paused near the back alley of a diner, where the smell of fried food drifted faintly through the air, like a memory someone had forgotten to close the door on. The diner belonged to Martha Bell. Martha was in her early 60s, a woman shaped by decades behind a counter. Broad-shouldered, practical, with silver-threaded hair tied back into a firm bun that never seemed to come loose. Her face carried the softness of someone who had once been gentler, layered beneath a lifetime of decisions that required her not to be. She did not step outside. Instead, she pushed open the back door just enough to place a small paper bag on the ground. Inside were scraps, toast ends, a piece of bacon, something fried that had gone cold. She did not call Walter's name. She did not look at him, but she did not throw the food away either. Walter waited until the door closed before stepping forward. He crouched slowly, joints stiff, and opened the bag. Sable did not move. Walter broke the bread in half, then hesitated. He glanced at the dog, then at the street, then back at the food. Without a word, he handed the larger piece to Sable. "Eat," he murmured, his voice rough but not unkind. Sable accepted it, but not immediately. He looked up at Walter first, searching his face as if confirming something unspoken. Only after a faint nod did the dog lower his head and begin to eat, controlled, measured, never desperate. Walter smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Still got better manners than most folks," he muttered. Across the street a man stood watching. Elias Mercer did not look like someone who lingered without reason. At 40 he stood tall, about 6'1", with a broad-shouldered frame that carried strength without excess. His movements were still, precise, the kind shaped by years of discipline rather than display. His face was sharply defined, clean-shaven, with a strong jaw and features that might have been called handsome if they weren't so quiet. His dark brown hair, cut into a neat undercut, carried faint streaks of silver at the temples, premature but not unexpected. His eyes were what people noticed if they looked long enough. Blue-gray, deep, not empty, but heavy, like something inside them had settled too far down to be reached easily. He wore a fitted long-sleeve camouflage top, sleeves pulled down tight against his wrists. The fabric was clean, well-kept, paired with matching pants and worn boots, built for function, not style. Everything about him spoke of structure, everything except the stillness. Elias had been standing there longer than he realized. He told himself he was just observing. That old habit, watching exits, reading movement, understanding patterns, never left a man who had spent years as a Navy SEAL. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler. He didn't know how to walk away. Sable stopped eating. Mid-bite, without warning, the dog lifted his head. His ears angled forward, body tightening slightly, not in fear, not in aggression. Recognition. His gaze moved across the street and locked onto Elias. For a long moment, neither of them moved. There was no sound between them, no signal anyone else could see. But something passed there, quiet, precise, undeniable. Elias felt it before he understood it. It was not a plea. It was not a warning. It was familiarity, as if the dog had seen him somewhere before, or worse, as if it had been waiting. And for the first time since the funeral, Elias felt something shift inside his chest. Not pain, something closer to being seen. He stepped forward before the thought finished forming. Boots crossed the street in steady rhythm. People passed around him, barely noticing. The world remained exactly the same, except for the distance between him and the man on the ground. Walter looked up as Elias approached, instinctively bracing, not out of fear, but habit. People didn't walk toward him, not unless they wanted something. Elias stopped a few feet away. Up close, the details sharpened. The thinness, the exhaustion, the quiet dignity Walter still carried like a stubborn ember. And the dog. Sable stood now, positioning himself slightly between them, not blocking, not threatening, just present. Watching. Elias crouched slowly, movements controlled, giving space. From the paper bag in his hand, he pulled out a fresh loaf of bread. Still warm, the crust firm, the smell unmistakable. He set it down carefully. Then he reached into his pocket and placed a folded $10 bill beside it. Walter stared at the money, then at the bread, then at Elias. His brow furrowed slightly. "I don't take charity," he said quietly. Elias nodded once. "Then don't," he replied. Walter blinked. The answer wasn't what he expected. Elias tilted his head slightly toward Sable. "Feed him first." The words were simple. No force, no pity, just instruction. Walter hesitated. Pride rose in him, thin, fragile, but still alive. He opened his mouth to refuse again, but Sable shifted beside him, not pulling, not begging, just waiting. Walter exhaled slowly. "Stubborn thing," he muttered, though whether he meant the dog or himself wasn't clear. He reached for the bread, broke it, and once again handed the larger piece to Sable. This time the dog did not hesitate. He ate. Elias watched quietly. No satisfaction, no sense of doing something good. Just a small, steady feeling that something had been set back into place, though he couldn't yet see the shape of it. Walter tucked the money into his coat after a moment, not looking at Elias as he did. "Appreciate it," he said, voice low. Not grateful in the usual way, just honest. Elias stood. For a second, it seemed like he might say something more. He didn't. He turned and walked back across the street, disappearing into the same rhythm of the town that had ignored the man and the dog just minutes before. But something had changed. Walter watched him go. "Strange one," he said under his breath. Sable did not respond. He simply lifted his head, eyes following Elias until he vanished from view. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke through the street. Walter leaned back against the wall, pulling his coat tighter. "Well," he sighed, glancing at the dog, "guess we ain't invisible today." Sable remained still, but his gaze did not return to the street. It lingered in the direction Elias had gone, as if a path had already been chosen. And somewhere beyond the quiet hum of Briar Glen, beneath the brightness of a frozen morning, a story had begun, not with noise, not with urgency, but with a man who didn't walk away, and a dog who seemed to know why. The cabin at the edge of the forest did not feel like a home anymore. It was warm. Elias made sure of that. The fire in the stone hearth burned steady, logs stacked neatly beside it, heat pushing back against the creeping cold that pressed against every window. But warmth, he had learned, was not the same as comfort. Elias Mercer moved through the space with quiet efficiency, like a man following orders no one else could hear. He split wood behind the cabin, each strike of the axe clean and controlled. His breath came out in slow, visible clouds. His shoulders, broad and disciplined, carried the same tension they had on deployments. Only now there was no mission, no objective, no endpoint. Just repetition. Inside, he repaired a loose hinge on the back door, then a crack along the window frame, then the latch on a cabinet that didn't really need fixing. Anything to keep his hands occupied, anything to avoid sitting still. Because sitting still meant hearing the silence, and the silence carried his father's absence, like an echo that refused to fade. On a small table near the wall sat an old radio, black, dented, stubbornly alive. It crackled occasionally, the signal wavering as wind moved through the trees outside. It had belonged to Thomas Mercer, a man who had never thrown anything away if it still had a purpose. Elias reached out, turning the dial slightly. Static. Then a voice. Cold front intensifying across northern Montana. Temperatures expected to drop well below zero overnight. Wind chill reaching dangerous levels. He turned it off. Didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew what that kind of storm meant. Outside, the forest stood still, tall pines heavy with snow, branches creaking faintly under the weight. The sky had that pale, washed-out color that came before something worse. Elias leaned his hands against the wooden counter, staring at nothing in particular. He told himself it didn't concern him, that whatever happened in town wasn't his responsibility. But the thought didn't sit right. It never had. Back in Briar Glen, the day moved forward with its usual rhythm, though something beneath it had shifted. Walter Boone and Sable did not stay in one place long. They couldn't. Not when people began closing doors just a little faster when they passed. Not when conversations dipped into silence the moment they stepped too close. Walter adjusted his coat tighter around himself as he walked, the fabric stiff from cold and years of wear. His movements were slower than the day before, a faint stiffness settling into his joints. "Storm's coming," he muttered under his breath, glancing up at the sky. Sable walked beside him, but not quite the same as before. The dog's pace had changed, slightly more alert, slightly more deliberate. His ears twitched often, catching sounds beyond human reach. His eyes scanned not just for food or danger, but something else, something less defined. They passed a small shop near the edge of town. Outside stood June Holloway. She was in her early 50s, slender, with a quiet presence that seemed to soften the edges of whatever space she occupied. Her brown hair, threaded with silver, was pulled into a loose tie at the base of her neck. She wore a beige coat that fell neatly around her frame, simple but well cared for. June was the kind of person who noticed things others chose to ignore. And sometimes that made her uncomfortable. She held a folded wool blanket in her arms, hesitating just long enough for the moment to feel heavier than it should have. Then she stepped forward. "Sir," she said gently. Walter stopped, surprised. Most people didn't address him directly. June extended the blanket, not quite meeting his eyes, but not avoiding him either. "It's going to get colder," she added, as if that explained everything. Walter looked at the blanket, then at her. His instinct was to refuse. But the wind shifted just then, cutting through the thin layers of his coat, and his body made the decision before his pride could argue. "Thank you," he said quietly. June nodded once, relieved the exchange had ended without complication. She stepped back, returning to her shop as if nothing had happened. Walter wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, pulling it close. "See that?" he murmured to Sable. Still some folks left. Sable didn't react. His attention had already moved on. Near the far end of the street, a boy stood watching them. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Thin, bundled in a jacket, slightly too big for him, sleeves covering part of his hands. His hair was a messy shade of blonde, and his nose was red from the cold. His name was Caleb Turner. He wasn't afraid, not exactly. But he had been taught, quietly by the way adults behaved, that people like Walter were something to keep distance from. Still, the dog drew him in. Sable paused. The boy froze. For a moment, neither moved. Then Sable took a single step forward. Not fast, not threatening. Just enough. Caleb swallowed, heart beating faster. He looked back toward the store behind him, as if checking whether anyone was watching. No one was. Slowly, cautiously, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread. He held it out. Sable approached, lowering his head slightly, careful, measured. He took the bread gently from the boy's hand. No snap, no urgency, just quiet acceptance. Caleb's eyes widened. "He's nice," he whispered. Walter chuckled softly. "Better than most men I've met," he replied. For a brief moment, the world felt lighter. Then the wind picked up again. And the moment passed. Late afternoon settled into that strange stillness that comes before a storm. Walter and Sable had made their way toward the outer edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the forest began to reclaim the land. That's when Sable stopped. Completely. No hesitation. No shift. Just stillness. Walter took another step before realizing the dog wasn't beside him. "Sable?" he called, turning back. The dog stood facing the road that led out of town, the long, narrow stretch that disappeared into trees and snow. His body had changed, not tense, not afraid, focused. He took a step forward, then another. Walter frowned. "That's not our way," he muttered. But Sable didn't look back. He continued walking toward the road, slow but certain. Walter hesitated. Something in the air felt different. Not wrong, but not right either. He tightened his grip on the blanket and followed, because for the first time in years he wasn't sure who was leading whom. The light faded faster than expected. By the time Walter realized how far they'd gone, the town behind them had already disappeared into the falling gray of evening. The forest loomed ahead, dark and silent. The temperature dropped with it. Walter exhaled sharply, his breath thinner now, less steady. "Should head back," he muttered. But Sable kept moving, not deeper into the forest, just along the road, as if searching, as if remembering. Miles away, Elias stood in his cabin, staring at the door. He had already checked the locks twice, already stacked enough wood for days, already told himself there was nothing left to do. And yet, he couldn't sit down. He walked to the window, looked out, nothing but trees and snow. Still, his jaw tightened slightly. A thought surfaced, uninvited. Not a vision, not a voice, just a question. "Where are they?" He stepped back, ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't your problem," he said aloud. The words sounded hollow in the empty room. He glanced toward the table. The radio sat there, silent now. Next to it, a photograph. His father. Thomas Mercer stood in it, younger, smiling faintly, one hand resting on a wooden fence. A man who had believed, quietly, stubbornly, that people mattered. Elias looked away, then back again. Something in his chest tightened. Not sharp, not sudden, just persistent, like a door refusing to stay closed. Outside, the wind rose. Branches scraped against each other. The first thin line of snow began to fall again. Elias exhaled slowly, then reached for his coat. In the distance, the road stretched on, white, silent, unforgiving. Walter's steps had slowed, his breathing heavier now. Sable still moved ahead, pausing occasionally, glancing back just long enough to ensure the man followed. Not pushing, not forcing, guiding. Walter tightened the blanket around himself. "Hope you know where you're going," he muttered. But deep down, he had the uneasy feeling that the dog already did. The storm did not arrive all at once. It crept in. First as a whisper against the treetops, then a long, hollow breath sliding through the narrow streets of Briar Glen. By the time Elias Mercer's truck rolled past the last lit storefront, the world had already begun to fade into white. Snow moved sideways now, thin at first, then sharper, driven by a wind that did not care who stood in its path. Elias gripped the steering wheel with steady hands, his posture forward, eyes scanning through the shifting blur. The truck's headlights cut a narrow tunnel ahead, illuminating just enough to keep moving, but not enough to feel safe. He knew this kind of night, the kind that swallowed distance, the kind that erased people. He checked the side streets first, Then the alley behind the diner. Empty, no movement, no sound beyond the wind rattling loose metal and the distant creak of something struggling to hold. Elias stepped out of the truck, boots sinking into fresh snow. The cold hit him instantly, sharp and clean, but he didn't react. He moved forward, slow and deliberate, letting his eyes adjust, letting instinct guide him where logic had already failed. "Walter," he called once. The name vanished into the storm. No answer. He turned toward the back of the market, where the light from town didn't quite reach. A place people avoided even during the day. The kind of place someone might go, if they had nowhere else. The wind shifted, and then he saw it. Not clearly, not at first, just a darker shape against the snow, low to the ground, still. Elias moved faster. The shape resolved into two. Walter Boone lay slumped against the frozen wall behind the market, his body partially buried beneath drifting snow. His head had tilted forward, chin nearly touching his chest, breath so faint it was almost invisible. And over him, Sable. The dog lay curled along Walter's side, pressed close, his body positioned deliberately to shield the man from the worst of the wind. His sides rose and fell in shallow, uneven rhythm. Snow clung to his fur, melting slowly from the weak heat he still held. His eyes were open. Barely. They flicked toward Elias as he approached. No growl, no bark, just recognition, and something else. Relief. Elias dropped to one knee immediately. "Hey," he said quietly, voice steady despite the tightening in his chest. He brushed snow away from Walter's face, fingers moving quickly but carefully. The man's skin was cold. Too cold, but not rigid. Alive. Barely. Elias pressed two fingers against Walter's neck. A pulse. Weak. But there. "Stay with me," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if Walter could hear him. Sable shifted slightly, his body resisting the movement. For a moment, his muscles tensed, not in aggression, but in hesitation. Then Elias spoke again. "I've got him." Something in the tone, firm, certain, cut through whatever instinct remained. Sable exhaled slowly and moved aside, though not far. He stayed close, eyes tracking every motion. Elias worked quickly. He pulled off his outer layer and wrapped it around Walter's torso, then lifted the man with controlled effort, adjusting weight carefully to avoid shock. Walter was lighter than he should have been. Too light. Elias carried him back to the truck, each step measured against the wind. Sable followed. Not lagging, not leading. Matching pace. The cabin door slammed shut behind them, sealing out the storm with a dull, final sound. Inside, warmth struggled, but held. Elias laid Walter down near the hearth, close enough to feel the fire, but not close enough to burn. He moved with precision now, every action guided by memory drilled into him long before this night. Blankets, dry layers, slow heat, no sudden changes. He removed Walter's outer clothing carefully, replacing what he could with dry fabric. His hands never rushed. Hypothermia didn't forgive mistakes. Sable stood nearby, watching. The dog's body trembled faintly, exhaustion pulling at him, but he did not lie down. His gaze shifted between Walter and Elias, measuring, assessing, waiting. Elias glanced at him briefly. "You're not done yet either," he said. He grabbed an old towel, drying the dog's fur as best he could, working from the neck down, careful not to irritate the already chilled skin beneath. Sable endured it without resistance, though his breathing remained shallow. When Elias finished, he pointed toward a thick blanket near the fire. "Down." Sable hesitated. Just a second, then obeyed. He lowered himself slowly, but his head remained up, eyes still fixed on Walter. Elias returned to the man. Minutes passed. Then more. The fire crackled softly, the only steady sound in the room. Walter's breathing deepened, slightly. Color returned to his face, just a trace. Elias leaned back against the wall, one knee raised, forearm resting loosely across it. His body finally allowed itself to pause, but his eyes never left them. At some point in the long stretch of silence, Sable rose again. Slowly, deliberately. Elias noticed immediately. The dog walked, not toward the door, not toward the fire, but toward the far corner of the cabin, a place Elias rarely used. An old wooden chest sat there, covered in dust, its lid slightly warped with age. Sable stopped in front of it. Then he pawed at it, once, twice, not frantic, intentional. Elias frowned slightly, pushing himself to his feet. "That's not where you were sleeping," he muttered. He walked over, curiosity tugging lightly at the edge of his focus. Sable stepped back as he approached, making space, but not leaving. Watching. Elias reached down and lifted the lid. Inside were old belongings, tools, worn fabric, small keepsakes his father had stored away without explanation. But what caught his attention wasn't the objects. It was the smell. Faint, but familiar. Wood smoke, oil, and something else. Something that didn't belong to the present. Elias's expression tightened slightly. He closed the lid, looked at the dog. Sable held his gaze, as if he had meant for him to see it. And for a moment, Elias had the unsettling feeling that the night had not brought them here by chance. The fire burned lower. Elias added another log, adjusting the position carefully. He checked Walter again. Better. Still weak, but stable. "Stubborn old man," he muttered quietly. Behind him, Sable finally lay down fully, exhaustion overtaking vigilance. His head rested on his front paws, eyes half closed, but not fully. Even now, he watched. Elias moved to the small table, pouring water into a metal cup, letting it sit to warm slightly before bringing it back. He crouched beside Walter. "Easy," he said, lifting the man's head just enough to let a few drops touch his lips. At first, nothing. Then, a faint reaction. Walter's throat moved, a shallow swallow. Elias exhaled slowly. "That's it," he murmured. Another small victory, another inch pulled back from the edge. Time blurred. The storm raged outside, unseen but heard, wind battering the cabin walls, snow piling against the door, the forest groaning under pressure. Inside, there was only heat. And waiting. Elias must have dozed without realizing it, because when he opened his eyes again, the light had changed. Morning. Gray. Quiet. Still. The storm had passed, or at least moved on. Walter shifted. Barely, but enough. Elias straightened immediately, alert again. The old man's eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. His gaze unfocused at first, drifting across the ceiling, the walls, the unfamiliar space. Then he turned his head slightly, toward the fire, toward the dog. "Sable," he whispered, voice cracked and thin. Sable was already there. The dog pushed himself up, moving closer, his tail giving a faint, restrained motion. Not excitement, not energy, just confirmation. Walter's hand lifted weakly, fingers trembling as they reached toward the dog's fur. Sable lowered his head, pressing gently into the touch. "I'm here," Elias said quietly from the other side. Walter's eyes shifted to him. For a moment, confusion flickered. Then recognition followed. Not of the man, but of the moment. "You," Walter rasped. Elias nodded once. "You made it," he said. Walter stared at him for a long second. Then his gaze moved between Elias and Sable. Something in his expression softened. Not relief, not exactly. Something closer to acceptance. "Didn't think," he began, then stopped, breath catching slightly. Elias didn't push, didn't ask. Some things didn't need finishing. Walter exhaled slowly, settling back against the blankets. "Guess we're not done yet," he murmured. Sable stayed beside him, body pressed close, not out of fear, but presence. Elias sat back again, watching them both. The storm had passed, but something else had begun. And this time, he wasn't going to walk away. Morning did not rush into the cabin. It seeped in slowly, pale light filtering through frost-lined windows, soft and almost cautious, as if even the day itself was unsure what it might find inside. The storm had passed, but it had not left quietly. Snow pressed thick against the lower half of the door, and the world outside looked newly made, clean, silent, and somehow heavier than before. Inside, the air held warmth and something else, something shared. Elias Mercer stood near the stove, heating water in a dented metal kettle. His movements were measured, economical. The same discipline that had carried him through war now translated into smaller things. Pouring water, checking the fire, adjusting the blankets around a man who had almost not survived the night. Across the room, Walter Boone sat propped against a stack of folded blankets. His posture was still weak, shoulders curved forward, hands trembling faintly as he held a cup between them. But his eyes were clearer now, less clouded, more present, alive in a way that felt deliberate. Sable lay between them, not exactly at Walter's side, not exactly at Elias's feet. Between. His large body stretched across the wooden floor, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but attentive. Every so often his ears twitched, reacting to subtle sounds no one else noticed. A silent guardian to two men who had not yet decided what they were to each other. Walter took a slow sip of water, then exhaled carefully. "Didn't think I'd wake up in a place like this," he said, voice still rough but steadier than before. Elias glanced at him briefly. "Didn't think you'd make it," he replied, not unkindly. Walter huffed a faint breath that might have been a laugh. "Fair?" Silence followed, not awkward, but unfamiliar. Walter shifted slightly, his gaze drifting around the cabin. The walls were simple, built from aged wood that had darkened over time. Tools hung neatly in one corner. A chair sat near the fire, worn in the exact places a person would rest most often. It wasn't a house built for show. It was a place built to last. "You live out here alone?" Walter asked. Elias nodded. "Have for a while." Walter studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly, not suspicious, just curious in the way of someone who had learned to read people out of necessity. "Doesn't look like a place a man runs to," he said. Elias didn't answer right away, because the truth was, it wasn't. He turned back to the stove, pouring water into another cup. "It's a place you stay when there's nowhere else you feel like going," he said finally. Walter nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured, "I know that kind of place." Sable shifted, lifting his head slightly as the tone in the room changed, not tense, not sharp, but heavier. Elias handed Walter the cup. Their hands brushed briefly, Walter's skin still cool, Elias's steady and firm. The old man wrapped both hands around the cup, drawing warmth into himself like it was something he could store. After a moment, he spoke again. "I used to build things," he said. Elias looked at him. Walter gestured vaguely around the room. "Cabins like this, not this one, but like it. Strong corners, tight seams, something that could stand through a winter." His voice carried a faint pride, dulled but not gone. "What happened?" Elias asked. Walter's eyes dropped to the cup. He turned it slowly in his hands. "Same thing that happens to most things," he said quietly. "You miss a step, then another. Then you look up and realize you've been walking in the wrong direction for years." There was no drama in the way he said it, no attempt to justify, just fact. Sable let out a soft breath, shifting closer to Walter's leg. The movement was small, but intentional. Walter rested a hand on the dog's head. "Only thing I didn't lose," he added. Elias watched the gesture, the ease of it, the familiarity. He knew what it meant to have something, someone, that stayed when everything else didn't. But he also knew what it meant to lose it. His jaw tightened slightly. "My father built this place," he said after a moment, nodding toward the walls. Walter looked up. "Good work," he said. Elias gave a short nod. He knew what he was doing. Another pause. "He's gone now," Elias added, the words quieter. Walter's expression shifted. Not pity, not surprise. Recognition. "How long?" he asked. "A few weeks." Walter nodded again, slower this time. "That's still fresh," he said. Elias didn't respond, because fresh wasn't the word he would have chosen. It felt older than that, like something that had been building long before it finally broke. Walter's gaze drifted toward the far wall. There, partially obscured by shadow, hung a framed photograph. It was simple, nothing elaborate. A man standing beside a wooden fence, one hand resting lightly on the post. The kind of photo taken without intention of becoming important. Walter leaned forward slightly, squinting. "That him?" he asked. Elias followed his gaze. "Yeah." Walter didn't speak immediately. He stared at the image, his breathing slowing, not from weakness, but from something else entirely. Something deeper. "I've seen that face before," he said softly. Elias frowned. "In town?" Walter shook his head. "No." His eyes didn't leave the photograph. "Long time ago," he added. "Different winter." The room seemed to still around the words. Sable lifted his head again. Elias's posture changed, subtle but clear. "How long?" he asked. Walter leaned back slowly, the weight of memory settling across his features. 10, maybe 15 years, he said. I was on the road, not in good shape. Snow came down harder than I expected. He paused. His hand tightened slightly on the blanket. I didn't think I was going to make it that night. Elias didn't move. Walter's gaze remained fixed on the photograph. Then a man pulled over, he continued. Didn't ask questions. Didn't wait for answers. Just got me in his truck, brought me somewhere warm. A faint, almost invisible smile touched the corner of his mouth. Didn't even tell me his name. Elias's chest tightened. He already knew, but he needed to hear it. Walter finally looked at him. You got his eyes, he said quietly. The words didn't hit like a shock. They settled, heavy, certain. Elias exhaled slowly, but the air didn't seem to leave his lungs properly. For a moment, the cabin felt smaller, like the walls had shifted closer. Yeah, he said. It was all he could manage. Sable stood fully now, stepping between them, not interrupting, not breaking the moment, just anchoring it. Walter looked down at the dog, then back at Elias. He didn't stay long, Walter added. Just made sure I wasn't going to die. Then he left. A soft breath escaped him. Guess some people don't need to stick around to change something. Elias looked at the photograph again, at the man who had been his father, at the man who had been something else to someone else entirely. Not just a parent, not just a memory, but a moment in another life, a life Elias had never seen. And suddenly, his loss felt different, not smaller, but wider. The fire crackled softly as the weight of that realization settled into the room. Walter shifted again, easing back against the blankets. I was going to leave town before the storm, he said after a while. Elias glanced at him. Why didn't you? Walter snorted lightly. Ask him, he said, nodding toward Sable. Elias raised an eyebrow. Walter shook his head, a faint smile breaking through. That dog's got his own ideas, he said. Wouldn't go the way I was heading. Kept pulling me back. Same stretch of road, over and over. He paused, like he knew something I didn't. Sable didn't react. He simply sat there, calm, composed, unbothered by the implication. Elias studied him for a moment, then looked away, because there was no logical explanation for that. And yet, it didn't feel like coincidence. The day moved slowly after that. Walter rested. Elias worked quietly around the cabin. Sable drifted between them, never fully choosing one over the other, but never leaving either alone for long. Outside, the snow settled into stillness. Inside, something began to take shape. Not friendship, not yet. Something quieter, something that didn't need naming to exist. As the light faded toward evening, Walter closed his eyes, his breathing steady now, no longer shallow. Elias sat near the fire, staring into the flames. For the first time since his father's death, the silence didn't feel like something pressing in on him. It felt like something shared, and that made all the difference. The storm left the world looking innocent. Morning sunlight stretched across Briar Glen like a quiet apology, turning every snow-covered surface into something bright and untouched. The trees stood still, their branches no longer groaning under the wind, only whispering faintly as light moved between them. From the outside, it looked like a new beginning. Inside the cabin, it felt like something else entirely. Elias Mercer stood at the doorway, one hand resting against the wooden frame, watching Sable move through the snow just beyond the porch. The dog's body had changed in subtle ways over the past days, less rigid, less guarded. Strength was returning, slowly but surely, to the way he carried himself. His coat had begun to regain its sheen. His movements were smoother, more confident, alive again. Elias folded his arms, his posture relaxed, but his gaze focused. "Don't push it," he called out. Sable paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Not disobedient, just considering. Then he trotted a few steps farther before circling back toward the cabin, snow crunching beneath his paws. Inside, Walter Boone sat at the small wooden table, wrapped in the same wool blanket June had given him days before. He looked better, not strong, not fully steady, but present in a way that mattered. His hands no longer shook as much. His breathing had settled into something resembling normal. But his eyes had changed. They watched everything more carefully now, as if measuring something that only he could see. Walter followed the dog's movement with a quiet expression, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "He's coming back faster each time," he said. Elias stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Instinct," he replied. Walter shook his head slightly. "Not just that." Elias didn't respond. He moved to the counter, picking up a cup and pouring water, his motions steady and practiced. Walter leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward Sable again as the dog pushed the door open with his nose and stepped inside. Snow clung to his fur, melting slowly as the warmth reached him. He didn't shake it off immediately. Instead, he walked past Walter, past the fire, and stopped beside Elias. Elias glanced down. Sable sat, not at his feet, not beside him, but close enough that the space between them felt chosen. Walter saw it. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. "Yeah," he murmured after a moment. "That's what I thought." Elias stiffened slightly. "What?" Walter met his eyes. "That's not my dog anymore," he said. The words weren't bitter. They weren't sad. They were calm. Elias frowned. "That's not how it works," he replied. Walter smiled faintly. "That's exactly how it works," he said. "Just not the way people like to admit." Sable lifted his head, ears flicking at the shift in tone, but he didn't move. He stayed where he was. Elias set the cup down a little harder than intended. "He's yours," he said, voice lower now. Walter studied him for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "Let me ask you something," he said. "If I walked out that door right now, what do you think he'd do?" Elias didn't answer, because he already knew, and he didn't like it. Walter nodded once, as if confirming the silence. "That's not betrayal," he said quietly. "That's choice." The word hung in the room. Choice, not loyalty, not ownership, something deeper. Elias looked away, toward the window, toward the snow, anywhere but at the dog sitting beside him like he belonged there. The rest of the day passed in small, quiet pieces. Walter insisted on helping, despite Elias telling him twice to rest. He moved slowly, but with purpose, adjusting things around the cabin, straightening tools, checking joints in the wood, like muscle memory had returned to him without permission. At one point he crouched near the base of the wall, pressing his palm against a seam where two planks met. "Good work," he muttered. "Still holding." Elias watched him from across the room. "You can tell that just by touching it?" he asked. Walter shrugged slightly. "Wood talks," he said. "Most people just don't listen." Elias nodded faintly. That made sense, more than it should have. Sable moved between them, occasionally stopping to rest, occasionally stepping outside for short bursts before returning again. Each time, he came back faster. Each time, he went to the same place, beside Elias. Walter noticed. He always noticed. Late afternoon settled into that soft, golden quiet that comes after a storm. Walter stood by the door, one hand resting lightly against the frame. He had insisted on stepping outside for air, though his strength had not fully returned. Sable followed him out. Elias stayed inside, watching through the window. Walter took a few steps into the snow, slower now, careful. His breath showed in thin, steady lines as he looked out across the open stretch beyond the cabin. "Beautiful," he murmured. Sable stood beside him. Then, without warning, the dog stepped away. Not far, just a few feet, and sat, facing Walter, not Elias. Walter frowned slightly. "That's new," he said under his breath. Sable didn't move. He just sat there, looking at him. Waiting? Walter's expression shifted, subtle but real. Recognition, not of a command, not of habit, something else. "All right," he said quietly. "I hear you." Inside the cabin, Elias felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't know why, but he suddenly had the strange, unmistakable sense that a decision had just been made, and he hadn't been part of it. That night, Walter was quieter than before. He spoke less, moved less, but not from weakness, from certainty. Elias noticed the difference, even if he didn't understand it. "Something on your mind?" he asked at one point. Walter shook his head. "No," he said. "Something off my mind." Elias frowned slightly, but didn't press. Some answers came only when they were ready. Others never did. Sometime before dawn, the cabin fell into a deeper stillness, the kind that doesn't come from sleep. The fire had burned low, leaving only a soft glow in the hearth. Shadows stretched across the walls, long and quiet. Elias stirred slightly in his chair, half aware, his body resting but not fully surrendered. He didn't hear the door open. He didn't hear the slow, careful steps across the floor. But Sable did. The dog lifted his head, watched, did not follow, did not move. He simply observed as Walter Boone, wrapped in his worn coat and the blanket that had kept him alive, paused once at the doorway. For a moment, he looked back. Not at the room, not at the fire, at the dog. Their eyes met. No command, no hesitation, just understanding. Walter nodded once, then he stepped out into the fading dark. The door closed behind him without a sound. When Elias woke, the light had just begun to return. The cabin felt different, not colder, not emptier, just changed. He straightened slowly, running a hand across his face. "Walter?" he called. No answer. He stood, scanning the room. The blankets near the fire were undisturbed. The chair was empty. The door, slightly ajar. Elias moved quickly now, crossing the room and pulling it open. Cold air rushed in. Outside, the snow lay untouched except for one thing. Footprints, faint, already softening under the early morning light, leading away from the cabin. Alone. Elias stepped forward, boots sinking into the snow. "Walter!" he called again. The forest gave him nothing back. He followed the tracks for several yards before stopping, because he knew he wasn't going to catch him, not this way, not like this. Elias stood there for a long moment, staring at the fading marks in the snow. Then, behind him, he heard movement. Sable. The dog stood in the doorway, watching. Elias turned. "Go," he said, gesturing toward the tracks. "Find him." Sable didn't move. Elias frowned. "Go." Still nothing. The dog remained where he was, not disobedient, not confused. Still. Elias's jaw tightened. "Damn it," he muttered. He stepped back toward the cabin, frustration flickering beneath the surface. Inside, something caught his eye. On the table, a folded piece of paper, and beside it, a worn leather collar. Elias picked it up slowly. The leather was old, softened by time, marked by small cracks along its edge. Used, loved, left behind. He opened the letter. The handwriting was uneven, but steady enough to read. "He was never mine to keep. He stayed because I needed him. Now he stays because you do." Elias's grip tightened slightly on the paper. "Don't make him choose again." He exhaled slowly, lowering the letter. Behind him, Sable stepped closer. Not pressing, not demanding. Just there. Elias turned, looking down at the dog. For a moment, neither moved. Then Elias reached out, his hand resting lightly against Sable's neck. The dog didn't flinch, didn't shift. He leaned into it, and for the first time since his father's death, Elias didn't feel alone. The days after Walter Boone's departure did not rush forward. They unfolded carefully, like pages turned by a hand that had learned not to tear what was fragile. Morning in Briar Glen returned to its quiet rhythm, smoke rising from chimneys, boots pressing new patterns into old snow, doors opening to let warmth spill briefly into the cold before closing again. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside Elias Mercer's cabin, everything had. The leather collar still rested on the wooden table beside the folded letter. Elias had not moved it, not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't ready to decide where it belonged. Some things felt heavier when given a place. Sable moved differently now, not freer, not restless, settled. He no longer hovered between spaces. He no longer looked toward the door with the quiet tension of someone waiting. Instead, he stayed, not out of habit, out of choice. Elias noticed it in small ways, the way the dog followed him, not because he was called, but because he wanted to be where Elias was, the way he rested his head near Elias's knee in the evenings, eyes half closed but aware, the way he stood at the door each morning, waiting, not to leave, but to go somewhere together. It was not obedience, it was alignment. Elias didn't comment on it. He simply adjusted. The wooden chest in the corner had remained closed for days, until one afternoon when the silence in the cabin grew too still to ignore. Elias crossed the room, knelt, and opened it again. Inside were objects that carried no immediate value, Tools worn smooth from use, folded cloth, small pieces of life his father had chosen to keep. And beneath them, a notebook, leather-bound, edges softened by time. Elias hesitated before picking it up, then opened it. The handwriting was familiar, steady, deliberate, each line written by a man who didn't waste words. Not a journal, not exactly, more like records, dates, places, short descriptions. Fixed a roof for Mrs. Carter. Didn't want help. Left wood by the door anyway. Gave old boots to a man near the highway. He pretended not to need them. Helped a woman get her car started. She cried. I didn't ask why. Elias turned the pages slowly. There were dozens of entries, hundreds maybe, all the same pattern. No names, no praise, no explanations, just action. Then, near the middle of the book, a line written slightly larger than the rest. When the weight gets too heavy, don't carry it alone. Elias stared at it for a long time. Sable approached quietly, sitting beside him without sound. His head tilted slightly, as if sensing the shift in Elias's breathing. Elias closed the notebook, not because he was done reading, but because he understood enough. The next morning, Elias did something he hadn't done in weeks. He drove into town. The truck moved slowly over packed snow, engine humming low, tires gripping carefully with each turn. Sable sat upright in the passenger seat, posture alert but relaxed, eyes scanning the road ahead. Not searching, observing. Briar Glen looked the same as always, but Elias saw it differently now. The diner stood at the center, its windows fogged with warmth inside. People moved through the street in familiar patterns. Conversations rose and fell like background noise. He parked near the side. Didn't go inside. Instead, he stepped out, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. Sable jumped down beside him, landing lightly despite his size. They walked. No destination, just movement. Near the edge of town stood a small house that leaned slightly to one side. The paint had peeled in long strips, exposing weathered wood beneath. The front steps sagged unevenly, one plank visibly cracked. A woman stood outside, struggling with a snow shovel. Her name was Margaret Maggie Klein. She was in her late 60s, tall but bent slightly at the shoulders, her frame thinner than it should have been for the cold she lived in. Her hair, once dark, had faded to a soft gray, pulled loosely into a low tie. Her face carried deep lines, not just from age, but from years spent holding more than she ever said aloud. Her husband had died 3 winters ago. Since then, she had learned how to do everything alone, or at least how to try. She lifted the shovel again, pushing against the packed snow with effort that showed in the tightening of her jaw. Sable stopped. Elias noticed immediately. The dog's body had shifted. Subtle, but clear. Not alert. Focused. He stepped toward the house. Elias followed. Maggie looked up, startled by the sound of boots approaching. Her grip tightened on the shovel. "I'm fine," she said quickly, before Elias even spoke. Her voice carried that familiar tone, defensive, practiced, worn from years of refusing help before it could become pity. Elias nodded once. "Didn't say you weren't." He stepped past her, took the shovel from her hands, not forcefully, but with quiet certainty. Maggie blinked. "What are you—" Elias didn't answer. He just started clearing the path. His movements were efficient, controlled. Snow lifted, shifted, thrown aside with a rhythm that didn't break. Sable sat near the edge of the yard, watching, not guarding, just present. Maggie stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. Then, slowly, she stepped back. Not because she had accepted the help, but because she no longer knew how to refuse it. Halfway through, clearing the walkway, Sable stood abruptly. No sound had changed, no movement in the street. And yet, the dog turned his head sharply toward the side of the house. Elias noticed. He always did. Sable walked, not toward the road, not toward Maggie, but toward the narrow gap between the house and the shed behind it. He stopped there, lowered his head, and let out a soft, almost inaudible whine. Elias straightened. The shovel paused mid-motion. "What is it?" he murmured. Sable didn't move, didn't bark, just stayed there, looking, waiting. Elias stepped toward him, boots crunching slowly against the snow. He rounded the corner and froze. A section of the siding had come loose during the storm. Behind it, the insulation had torn away, leaving a narrow opening where wind had been cutting through all night. Inside, pipes exposed, frozen solid. Elias exhaled slowly, then glanced back toward Maggie. She was still standing in the yard, watching them both. He understood immediately. If that pipe burst, she wouldn't just lose water, she'd lose the house. And in this kind of cold, that meant everything. Elias didn't hesitate. He moved quickly now, checking the structure, assessing damage. "Get me a bucket," he called out. Maggie blinked, then nodded, turning toward the door with more urgency than she had shown all morning. Sable remained by the opening, watching closely as Elias worked. Minutes passed. Then more. The cold fought back. But this time, so did someone else. By the time Elias finished, the immediate danger had passed. The pipe held. For now. Maggie stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the repaired section of her home. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Elias wiped his hands against his coat. "Yeah," he replied. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain, because there was nothing to explain. Maggie studied him for a moment, then her gaze shifted to Sable. The dog met her eyes calmly, tail still, posture steady. "Smart dog," she said. Elias nodded once. "Yeah?" He glanced down at Sable, then back at the house, at the cleared path, at the small, fragile Victory standing in front of him. Something in his chest shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make the silence feel different. By the end of the week, small changes began to appear in Briar Glen. Not loud, not obvious, but real. A box of canned food left outside the diner with no note. A repaired fence behind a house no one had asked about. A cleared walkway before someone even realized it needed clearing. People noticed. They didn't say much, but they noticed. And sometimes that was where change began. That evening, Elias returned to the cabin. Sable walked beside him, matching pace. Inside, the fire burned steady. The notebook lay open on the table. Elias glanced at it once, then closed it. Not because he was done, but because he no longer needed to read what it said. He understood. Sable settled near the door, watching the quiet settle in around them. Elias sat down in the chair his father used to occupy. For a moment, he hesitated, then leaned back. And for the first time, the silence did not feel like something he had to escape. It felt like something he could stay in. And that, more than anything, was the beginning. The snow in Briar Glen did not melt quickly. It softened first, edges losing their sharpness, the white giving way to a dull sheen under the slow return of sunlight. Days passed with a quiet patience, as if the town itself was relearning how to breathe after holding it in too long. Elias Mercer stood at the edge of the road leading out of town, hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture still but not rigid. The same place he had once followed fading footprints. Now there was nothing left to follow. The snow had long since covered whatever path Walter Boone had taken. Wind and time had done what they always did, erased what could not stay. Sable stood beside him, not searching, not restless. Still. The dog's gaze moved over the distant tree line, ears flicking at faint sounds carried on the air. He did not pull forward. He did not look back. He simply existed in the moment. Elias glanced down at him. "You don't miss him?" he asked quietly. Sable didn't react, not because he didn't understand, but because the question didn't need answering. Elias exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he muttered. "Guess that's not how it works." He turned back toward town. This time, he didn't hesitate. Briar Glen had changed, not all at once, not in a way anyone could point to and name, but it had shifted. The diner no longer felt like a place people passed through without looking. A wooden crate now sat near the entrance, filled with canned food, gloves, old scarves, items left by hands that didn't stay to be thanked. No sign,